Well, no one knows how many people are affected by the home fire cladding scandal, and it's surely fair to call it a scandal. One estimate now suggests that over 4 million people may live in homes thought unsafe in different ways in the light of the Grenfell Tower disaster. Maybe 700,000 people are still living in homes with flammable cladding, but everyone knows now the government's response today hasn't satisfied or maybe matched up to the needs of people trapped in unsafe property, unable to sell up and move on, or facing crippling bills and even bankruptcy from the costs of the work that's needed on their homes. Those unhappy, unlucky households seem to have loud and angry MPs on both sides of the Commons in their corner. We'll weigh up the government's support scheme and gauge the reaction and the possible political rebellion that's maybe building now. If you're one of those unlucky ones, do tell us your story. Send us a text to 87222. Start with the word Times, or a tweet to @Times Radio, or to me at JP on Politics. In the House of Commons earlier, the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, outlined the new measures, an extra £3.5 billion to remove the dangerous cladding.
I'm therefore, today, making an exceptional intervention on behalf of the government and providing certainty that leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings will face no cost for cladding remediation works. We will make further funding available to pay for the removal and replacement of unsafe cladding for all leaseholders in high-rise residential buildings of 18 metres and above, or above 6 stories in England.
And for buildings lower than 18 metres, Jenrick says the risks are significantly lower, with remediation of cladding unlikely to be needed. But for those that do, a loan was available.
The government will develop a long-term scheme to protect leaseholders in this situation, with financial support for cladding remediation on buildings between 4 and 6 stories. Under a long-term low-interest scheme, no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, many far less.
Tom Newton Dunn joins us now, our chief political commentator. Hello, Tom.
Good afternoon, John.
So, Tom, you were listening to that. How did you weigh up what you heard in the Commons, and how did it go down there?
Well, it's a lot of money, I think, has to be the first reaction. £3.5 billion from Robert Jenrick, the Housing Secretary, he's managed to persuade the Chancellor to part with. And that is no small sum. It's going to be paid for, certainly in part, by a couple of new taxes levied on developers, big developers, and I don't think too many people will cry too much over that, although they are, of course, protesting. It's in two elements, of course. It's the leaseholders in high-rises, so anyone in a block of flats of 6 stories or more, 18 metres or more, face no cost at all to remove this cladding that's been in place for 4 years now, as well as a complete impediment to be able to sell. Of course, it's a huge safety risk after we saw what happened with the Grenfell fire tragedy. But it's the other element. It's for smaller blocks, buildings with stories 4 to 6 tall. That is where the problem is. They're going to have to pay some of the costs themselves, but on a very long repayment, £50 a month, no more at all to remove their cladding. And that is where the political problem is with all this, because they say, the campaigners say, that this goes back on a Tory government promise that was made to leaseholders. They would not have to pay a penny. They would not be on the hook at all to remove this cladding. They also said it could cost them £30,000 each, which leaves them in debt for some 30 years to get this stuff off their premises. And also that freeholders, if, for example, you own a block or you own a flat in a block, and you'll just pass on that cost to the poor person renting in it. So that will force up rent to people who might not be able to afford it. And there are roughly 80,000 blocks of flats between 11 and 18 metres high that will get affected by this repayment. And so that is the outrage. Stephen McParland, Tory MP, has been very upset by this afternoon, tweeting some quite extraordinary sort of thoughts. Said he was listening to the statement from Robert Jenrick with his head in his hands, a portrayal of millions of leaseholders, shocking incompetence, he said, and called for the Prime Minister to step in. But Robert Jenrick responded. One stage, the debate in the Commons got a little heated, and he said to a Labour MP, well, you want the government to pick up the bill for all of this, do you? Well, I have to tell you, it's a huge amount of money. Who do you think should pay for it? Which, of course, is the government's point, that they are £400 billion in debt because of the coronavirus crisis. You might say, what's another few billion here or there? Well, the answer is it's a few pennies on income tax.
Yeah, strong stuff. And we're going to be talking to Stephen McPartland in just a moment. But as you read it, Tom, how close is Robert Jenrick to safety on this, to meeting the kind of demand that's coming from all of those householders, and maybe dealing with the House of Commons and coming through in one piece? Is there the potential here, with rebels like Stephen McPartland joining up maybe with the opposition to threaten the government's position? Because that's always the key point.
Yeah, and there always is at times like this, and this Parliament, despite the fact the Prime Minister's majority 80, has been proved not to be a wholly loyal one and to be quite independent-minded. That said, the rebels, led by Stephen McPartland perhaps, would have to get 40 different Tory MPs voting with them, or more, and Labour to defeat the government. That is quite a big ask. There is some sympathy in the Tory backbenchers for the incredibly parlous state the government finances are in, and we'll know more about that in the budget in a few weeks' time now. So at the moment, it feels like quite a big ask. It always is a big ask to defeat any government at that sort of scale, but we'll have to see how this one pans out. I mean, there are a lot of constituents in these blocks, these 80,000 or so blocks, a lot in potential swing Tory seats and potentially some red wall Tory seats. These are exactly the sort of perhaps less well-off voters who live in these sorts of flats the Tories are going to have to cling on to. So we'll see how the numbers add up.
Yeah, I mean, the government had already committed something like £1.6 billion. This new package adds on another £3.5 billion. And I saw one estimate that to meet the demands that are being thrown at the government, you'd need many times that. But of course, at this time of crisis, where the government is spending hundreds of billions, borrowing hundreds of billions of pounds to deal with the emergency, numbers like that seem much less by comparison, don't they?
They do, John, and I think that's part of the problem, really, because, back in the old times of the financial crisis deficit back in 2008, I mean, that was the government at its worst, was running a deficit of, 160, 170 billion pounds a year. We're now going to be over 400 pretty soon. We get the new numbers from the ABR at the budget. So because they are throwing such enormous sums of money at keeping the economy going, the argument, therefore, when others say, well, what's a few billion more to help my cause or your cause, is a little bit more powerful. And the problem is, if everyone's cause is helped, then that deficit, which is going to have to be run down at some stage and the debt repaid at some stage, has to come from somewhere. The total figure that's been talked about, if the government was to pick up the tab for all of this, is 15 billion. And just to put that into context, John, what that actually means is the Home Office's annual budget is roughly 12 billion pounds a year. So this would be more than the entire Home Office budget for an entire year. So that's everything we spend on police, firemen, immigration, the lot, simply to fix this problem. So it really is an absolutely huge sum of money.
Okay, Tom, we're going to talk